Okay, welcome everyone to another webinar. Now today we're going through the different types of behaviour. Now this really concerns people who work particularly in primary school and high schools, not so much in the adult education world. And we're really focusing on an area that we call behaviour management or classroom behaviour management. Now I recently did a video on the root causes of behaviour. So I'd recommend watching this video in combination with that particular video because there's a bit of overlap there and they are sort of related in many different ways. And I think if you were to watch just this one but not the root causes one, you're only getting half the picture and vice versa. So I don't think you necessarily need to watch the other one first or anything, but so long as you do watch both, then I think you'll be doing fine there. Now, traditionally speaking, in the education world, we divide behaviour into two real categories. Now, and again, well, not again, but the reason for why we do that and the reason for why in education in particular, we divide everything into categories, whether it's multiple intelligences or learning styles or Bloom's taxonomy. There's all these different categories. You might have seen a lot of my teaching strategies videos where I've done phonics, and we divide the process of learning phonics or the hierarchy of phonological awareness or phonological instruction into various different steps. From there, there's also other areas like explicit instruction, which again we divide into various different ways to less of an extent, but we certainly try to categorize what it means to do, say, explicit instruction and then divide it into little subsections so we can study each of those sections. Now, the reason we do that is probably, there's two or three reasons. One of the reasons is because things are so complex when you're dealing with other humans, and particularly when you're doing large groups of humans, and you're trying to figure out ways that you can deal with these issues in simple terms. And not only that, but be able to talk to colleagues and be able to study and think about and reflect on and come up with strategies and systems and so forth. It's really hard to come up with a system for behaviour management if you don't think about ways in which you can divide different types of behaviour into slightly different categories, because there are hundreds of different types of behaviours that we have to deal with, and by dividing them up into specific categories, we can then think about each category individually and think about the ways in which we manage each behaviour and where we sort of sit on that spectrum. So if we've got a huge number of students causing problems with in one category, then that will be different. We'll treat that and we'll treat that situation differently to if we have an equal number of students in different categories and things like that. So, okay, the most basic type of behaviour or category of behavioural issues or behavioural problems or behavioural challenges, whatever you want to call it, is simply disruptive behaviour. Now, I'll go through a list later on. Once I've done these four, I'll show you my four that I always quite regularly talk about, and we'll talk about them for a little bit. And then I'll go through and write up a bit of a list about disruptive behaviours and the next category as well, just to give you something of an idea of what we're talking about. And so that way you can compare the two. But in summary or in simplistic terms, disruptive behaviour is exactly that. Behaviour that is disruptive. It's annoying, it's irritating, it's sometimes repetitive, it's sort of kids being kids and so forth. Now, most students will be disruptive at some point in time, even the best students. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are disrupting others. They can also be disrupting their own learning as well. So quite often when we talk about disruptive behaviour, we're either talking about one-off or we're talking about repetitive behaviour. Now, once it starts to become repetitive, it may potentially move into the next category. So that next category is what we call behaviours of concern. Okay, so these ones are just the annoying things. The kid might throw something, they might stand up, walk over and punch another student, just sort of jokingly or whatnot. Obviously not seriously, they punch them in the face, it might be, so that certainly would fall into this category. So they're quite often those one-off type things, or they might have a little bit of repetitiveness in them, but generally speaking, they're just the annoying things that just disrupt the daily lesson. Now, most of your behavioural work, the things that you're doing in a classroom to prevent behaviour, will fit into this disruptive behaviours category. And in fact, all of your low-key responses, if you've seen that video, low-key responses, almost always fit into that disruptive behaviour category. To give you an idea, I would guess that a lot of teachers and teacher aides probably deal with one of these disruptive behaviours every 60 seconds or so. So quite often you'll deal with 5 or 6 of them in a matter of literally 10 seconds. So I would guesstimate that this is kind of a 400 times a day type thing, assuming you're on class 6 hours a day, 5 hours a day, whatever it is. So you're asking not asking a ton of questions. You're dealing with disruptive behaviours non-stop. And there's obviously a spectrum there. So there are things that you can deal with those low-key responses, which can be as simple as just that. Or there might be some corrections where you're sort of saying, work, please, thank you. So there are different levels of responses. And it could also, even if it's a bit repetitive, include having a little bit of a chat to the student. So you might crouch down and say, look, I've got a job to do, and if I don't help these students here, I'm going to get in trouble. So I expect you to finish off what you're doing here, to not talk to these students, otherwise I'm going to have to come back. So you're having a little bit of a word with the student, right? It's still a disruptive behaviour. It's just kind of irritating. It's nothing that's going to stress you out or give you a mental breakdown or anything. It's just what is probably the most irritating part of this from a teacher aide's perspective is the fact that there are so many of them. So you're constantly dealing with these different types of issues. Now, the other thing I will say is that sometimes it might be 400, but if you're doing a lot of really good instructional strategies and you're doing a lot of really good proactive behaviour management strategies, and you've watched a lot of these videos and the instructional videos and things, I think a lot of teachers who are sitting on 400, say a year 9 teacher or something, which is probably where the max number of behavioural issues sits at year 9, it probably sort of goes like that, right? Actually, it probably, realistically, it kind of goes, say it goes up, and it kind of goes like that, and then it sort of falls down a bit. At about year 10, there's year 11, there's year 12. Yeah, probably, yeah, no, say year 10 starts to fall off quite a bit. Year 9 will be there, so then 8, 7, that's probably about year 3, and so forth. So, yeah, something like that. I don't know, I'm just making this up as I go. So generally, point is that around that sort of age group is where the number of disruptive behaviours generally peaks. It depends. I mean, while I have taught everything from K to 12 and in a range of different schools, of course, it depends on the class. So I always say that 2 classes in the same school can be as different as 2 different schools in 2 different countries. So I don't think it's fair to necessarily just say that, you know, you're only going to experience that in year 9 or whatever. But anyway, so point is, you can get that down to somewhere around that 100 mark in a day, not relatively easily. You have to work quite hard to do that. But when you get it below 100, and to give you an indication, even if you're teaching adults, you're still doing something in the realm of maybe 50 or 60 because you're circulating, you're talking to students, you're standing in certain positions and things like that. Maybe not 50, but certainly if you're dealing with young adults, you're still going to be doing some anyway. So even super low-key responses, I guess, count in that calculation. And again, I'm just being sort of broad and generalistic here to give you an idea. Point is, disruptive behaviour, you're going to spend a huge amount of time dealing with disruptive behaviour. And even though I'm going through some of these other ones here, this is where it's at in terms of sheer volume. But they're also the easiest ones to deal with, and they're the easiest ones to apply those various different concepts that I go through in the other videos, like minimum necessary force, low-key responses, and the escalations and reverse escalations, and things like that. So while they are the most repetitive, they're also easy to deal with, and they're the easiest ones to get rid of by simply going through and having an appropriate system in place and working on gradual change and things like that. Anyway, the next thing we've got is behaviours of concern. Now, behaviours of concern is when things get a little bit more serious, and that's when students are, that's when you've got problems. So that can be things like meltdowns, it can be those power/manipulative type students, it can be anything that's dangerous, anything that is highly repetitive, fall into that behaviour of concern category. So while this stuff here generally you can deal with just as you go, this stuff here requires usually a more senior person in the school, usually some type of formal plan, and it'll be included in, say, an individual behaviour plan or individual behaviour management plan or general adjustment plan or whatever you call it in your particular area. So these are much, much more serious and require more effort and more proactive planning and a team effort and things like that. Whereas the disruptive ones are kind of, it happens and then it's done. And it might be a little thing that you deal with at the next break or whatever as well. So some type of follow-up, but nothing compared to those behaviours of concern. And again, it is a bit of a spectrum, right? So if you're, let's say well, I can do it over here. Let's say that you've got your behaviours of concern there and you've got your disruptive behaviours there. Now, a lot of your behaviours are going to fit at the top of that scale, so it's not really concerning. So let's say this is 0. They're going to fit around here, so that's just irritating behaviour. They get up, they get out of their seat. They're not really thinking about the rules. They're just off with the fairies or whatever. That sort of sits at that. But there's a point where those behaviours become serious enough, say when they get up towards the top here, and they fall into that category of behaviours of concern. So it is a bit of a spectrum, and you've got to really think about whether they're falling into that category or maybe it jumps back up to that level. And I like to think of the disruptive behaviour as something that you can generally deal with on your own. Whereas behaviours of concern is where you have to pretty much interrupt your free time, in a sense, your non-class time, to think about the best way to deal with that particular behaviour. These are the ones that cause a significant amount of stress. Obviously these, because they're so highly repetitive and it's happening so much, causes a lot of stress, but these are the ones that do require specialist strategies and techniques, sometimes even specialist staff and whatnot to help deal with them. So I'll just rub that bit off, and I'll rub that bit off. And those behaviours of concern, just to give you an idea, we might be dealing with, so power seekers, I'd say attention seekers, so they're at the lower end of the spectrum, but they're still in there anyway because, again, they're getting to the point where it's beyond being disruptive. Well, it's still disruptive, but it's getting to the point where it's gone from being one-off, maybe a bit repetitive, to falling into the category of being concerning. So, right, this behaviour can't go on. It's something that we need to address in a parent meeting or some type of planning process, or put some systems in place, or new curriculum, or new instructional strategies, or whatever we need to do. But something needs to happen. Any of those sort of chronic off-taskers, that chronic off-task or task avoidance type behaviours. And again, not just one-off, the kid's just being silly or having a bad day, or it's temporary type thing. This is where it becomes much more serious. Now, you can see how the definition here is kind of a bit loose, and it doesn't really matter. You're not going to get a question that says, or you're not going to get penalised as a teacher or a teacher aide or whatever if you're not 100% sure about what to put where, because the point of this is for you in your own mind to figure out what is important, what the behaviour that you're dealing with, where you're going to place it on that scale. So if it's just repetitive and it happened and the student mucks around every now and then, and you think, okay, it just falls into that disruptive behaviour category, then you can probably rest easy and think, well, we can do some things around it and try and prevent it, but it's not really concerning. Let's not waste our time on it. But on the other hand, if that behaviour, if you're noticing that it gets bad enough that you're making the decision that, right, I'm now going to class that as a behaviour of concern, then that's sort of like I wouldn't say a criminal charge, but you're gone from assault to manslaughter type of thing. Like, there's a big difference in the way in which that is dealt with in the behaviour management system and in the system that schools use and so on and so forth. So that's the first two and the most common ones. Now, when we talk about types of behaviour, you'll see this or something very similar to this in textbooks, and you might go to courses and seminars and things like that. These are the types of behaviour. These are the main two that you'll see all the time, and people use different terminology and stuff. I like to use 4, and that third one that I use is the disability/disorder sort of category. Because sometimes you can have behaviours of concern, but because it's caused by a disability or a disorder, you don't treat it in the same way as you would treat, say, a behaviour of concern from a student who doesn't have a disability or disorder. So it's treated in a very different way, just like we treat that in a very different way. I like to categorise it in a slightly different category. Now, we can have students with disabilities and disorders obviously can have disruptive behaviours, and we treat it in a certain way, and we look at the root cause and so forth. And they can also exhibit behaviours of concern, and they regularly do. A lot of them regularly do, right? So particularly, your meltdowns and escape motivated behaviours and so on and so forth. So that happens quite regularly. But I like to make that my own little category, because it is just a little bit of a reminder that if they fall into that category, then I guess, we do go about treating it in a very different way to if they fall into that category. And so it's just important to think about that. And the other thing that I like to point out here too is that quite often these are undiagnosed. So sometimes they are undiagnosed, as meaning the student doesn't have a formal diagnosis. So the classic case is ADHD, where a lot of students don't get diagnosed, and parents are changing their medication without telling schools and things like that. So that's causing a lot of behaviour problems and unexpected behavioural changes and so on and so forth. So now the other thing with these disabilities and disorders is because, and why it's important to have that category is because there are some extreme types of behaviour which would lead that student to be diagnosed as having particular disorders, such as oppositional defiance disorder, and there's a few other types. I think that's the main one statistically, I guess. And that's where students will generally they'll move away from a standard sort of school setting into some type of specialist behaviour centre, not a special needs centre for students with disabilities, but specifically for those with behavioural problems of that type of nature. So you're dealing with something completely different then, as opposed to your behaviours of concern, like attention seekers and off-taskers and power seeking. That never happens, so I wouldn't worry about that, but I put it up there because sometimes people talk about it. So they're the 3 sort of main categories that I talk about. And then you've got your unexpected change. Now, I like to talk about unexpected changes as if it is its own category. That can be temporary, can be permanent. But the problem with unexpected changes is because it can quite often be a mental health thing. It can quite often be a contextual issue. So a mental health thing, it could be bullying, anxiety, depression, a whole range of different things there. Again, it could be drug abuse, it could be so on, so it could be drugs, etc. And a contextual issue, as in what's happening at home. It could be parents going through a divorce, it's causing issues, and so on and so forth. So when students are behaving in this way, when their behaviour changes significantly and out of nowhere, and even if it's trending, so even if the behaviour seems to be getting worse, we treat that differently to how we treat, say, disruptive behaviours or behaviours of concern on their own, or even students who've got disabilities and disorders. assuming that that's not a learned response. So they're not learning to behave in a certain way because they're getting some type of, reward, like being able to get out of class or whatnot. So I like to keep that as its own little category because while it's quite rare to see this, if you do notice that students are exhibiting behaviours of concern, but they're doing it out of nowhere and for no apparent reason, then quite often there's going to be some type of underlying root cause of that might be worth a discussion with your manager about, or parents or whoever. So, and I think we deal with that slightly differently than a student who's been behaving like that for the last 3 or 4 years, or since the start of the term, a student has been disruptive. And again, even if they have a disability or disorder, if they do term 1, term 2, no problems, but then suddenly their behaviour starts changing significantly, then we deal with that very differently to the student who's always had those issues, especially if you know that they've had those problems in the years before. And quite often, you'll rarely be dealing with a student of this who falls into sort of this area. Like, very rarely will you be dealing with that student. Well, I guess sometimes if they're new to the school, but most of the time, before the school term starts or whatnot, the head of a learning area or the deputy or whoever, some type of school manager or previous teachers will be aware of that student and aware of the problems. Even if they come from another school or another school area, quite often parents will sometimes let the school know if they've had problems, and you can see from their previous results if you look at those. Most teachers never look at previous results, so I guess you wouldn't pick that information up there. But anyway, point is, so that there are these 4 different categories. Really there are 2. They're the 2 main ones. I just like to add them in just to give us a bit of food for thought, because, and again, they might overlap. So they might be partly that or whatever. But being able to accurately diagnose that a student is in this category as opposed to behaviours of concern makes a difference in the way in which we go about planning our way out of that particular situation. So if a student suddenly is massively off task and exhibiting all these behaviours of concern, like swearing at the teacher or storming off out of class and kicking things or whatever, those type of behaviours of concern, if the student's always done those things, or it's caused or something to do with a trigger in the sort of because of a disability or whatnot, or a disorder, then that's different than if that same behaviour was happening to a student who didn't have a disorder that we knew of, and it was unexpected and there were sudden changes. So we might start looking at that and thinking, okay, what is causing this? Is this a suicide thing? Could it lead to that? Is it a mental health thing that we need to be concerned about? Or is it a temporary thing? Is it just a one-off today, or what's sort of going on? So that's why I like to add these 2 little categories onto the end, because they do help us quite a bit. And a lot of people work permanently in this area. So if you're a teacher aide and you have what is sometimes referred to as a focus student, so one student that you deal with 70% of the time, I mean, that is your focus student, but you'll be circulating around looking at other students as well, because you want that student to be able to develop that independence and chat to their friends and all this kind of stuff. But the point is, if you're working in that space all the time, then this category sort of doesn't necessarily apply as much to you, because if that's, I guess, the normal for you, then you can still use these 3 other categories to an extent, still bearing in mind that you're going to have various different behaviours that are caused by or related to that particular disability or disorder. Noting also that just because a student has a disability or a disorder doesn't mean that behaviour was caused by that disability or disorder. Quite often there's an assumption, particularly with students with autism or any type of neurological disability disorder, that their behaviour is somehow related to the fact that they've got that diagnosis. Just like all kids, they might just be behaving in that particular way on that day because they're trying to avoid work or because they have that need to socialise. And they'll go about doing it in a slightly different way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a direct cause of the disability or the disorder, although quite often it is, or it's related or whatnot. But just bear in mind that you shouldn't always just make that simple, and I don't want to use the word naive, but simple assumption that the student's misbehaving, they have a disorder, therefore the behaviour was caused by the disorder, because that's not always how it works. Okay, So anyway, I think as I was saying before, we're going to write up some disruptive behaviours and behaviours of concern that will give you a bit of an idea about what's going on there, because we do want to have a little bit of a chat about a couple of other things as we go about doing that, and because I think it's important to just tease this out a little bit so that we've got a better idea of what's going on, and how personally I would divide these up and why we would divide them up into different categories and what that means for us as teacher aides or teachers or whatnot. So now how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? Okay, I'm going to do a line down there, line across there. We're going to do disruptive here. And over this other side, we'll do the behaviours of concern, just like that. So that way we can see a direct sort of relationship across there. Okay, so first one, most obvious, talking out of turn. So I'm just going to go through and write these quite quickly because otherwise we'll be here for a while. So talking out of turn basically means that the student is talking when they're not supposed to. So that can happen when the teacher's at the front, the teacher aide is helping a group 3-on-1. It can mean interrupting other students. It can mean calling out. There's lots of different reasons for that. And so there's a few different types of talking out of turn. But generally it's just sort of that irritating behaviour. Noise level is another one. So just during class, just being overly loud, the noise level will slowly go up, and normally that's caused by one or two students that is always raising the bar a little bit. You can normally you could identify who that is. Wearing a hat, classic, annoying, disruptive type behaviour. Middle of a class, kid just puts a hat on for no reason. Other sort of similar things that they're doing is throwing balls and stuff. So it's disruptive behaviour. It's also attention seeking, sort of obviously. Eating is another one. So you'll be sitting in class and kids start pulling out biscuits and start trying to sneak biscuits and things. And obviously you'd think, well, that's pretty innocent. But if you let that go, then it'd just be a nightmare and it causes fights and so on and so forth. So what have we got? Talking out of turn, noise levels, wearing a hat, eating. Out of seat is another classic one. I don't think I need to explain that one. Throwing things is another one. Dropping rubbish is a big one. Handwriting's getting messy. I'm going to write that one again. Dropping rubbish. Slow to work. Oops. So slow to start work is another sort of classic, just irritatingly disruptive type thing. Obviously swearing or name calling. I'm just going to write calling, and we're running out of room here. Daydreaming, that'll do. And instructions, as in not following them at all. So talking out of turn is just teacher talk for students talking when they're not supposed to be. Noise levels, I've done a video on noise levels. Wearing a hat, eating, using mobile phones, playing with a ball, things like this. Just those annoying things that students like to do when they're sort of pushing boundaries and whatnot. Getting out of their seat and wandering around, that's a big problem for middle school teachers in particular. Throwing things, so kids will, particularly pieces of paper or pen lids or whatever. If you don't stay on top of that one, it can snowball out of and become a big problem. So that's throwing things. Dropping rubbish, again, particularly, all years, maybe not year 11 and 12, and maybe not sort of the very lower years, depending on what they're doing, of course. But if kids are sitting in maths, say year 6 or something, and they're doing a maths activity, they'll pull pieces of paper, they'll leave it sitting on the desk, you'll have little bits of rubbish sitting everywhere, and if you don't stay on top of that, that can cause huge problems. Well, not huge problems, but you end up with a classroom that looks like a rubbish dump. Slow to start work, classic task avoidance type thing. Students will slowly open their file. I don't have my file. I left it at this place. I have to go get it out of my bag. Yada, yada, yada. Swearing, obviously, because it's disruptive, we're not talking about students who are directly swearing at teachers. Kids swear. That's just going to happen. If you go into the education world, particularly in the public sector, and you've got the attitude that if a kid swears, I'm going to lose my mind over it and I'm going to take it offensively, then you're not going to last very long. Kids swear all the time. As long as it's not at you or directed in some type of malicious way, then I regularly see teachers who, I guess, lose their minds over students who accidentally swear here and there, and then those students go home and they've got parents or siblings and whatever who swear 700 times an hour. So that's, again, I think there's ways in which we can deal with that are more professional. But watch my video about low-key responses and minimal necessary force there, and make sure you're sort of complying with those requirements or those best practices, because they are important. Swearing or name-calling, daydreaming, written very messily there. Very, very messily. It's hard to write on an angle down. Yeah, daydreaming, so kids that are just not quite paying attention. Again, it's disruptive because you have to then go and tell them what to do again. They won't know what to do. They'll start interrupting their friends. And once they feel that, well, I'm 15 minutes into the lesson, I haven't really done anything, there's no point, and so on and so forth. So that you can see where that leads to other issues. And of course, not following instructions, particularly when they're daydreaming or they're just not really listening. So it might be like, go do these 3 things, and they'll do 2 but not the 3rd or whatever. So their instructions might not sort of fit under this category, but again, it doesn't really matter. It's up to you. If there's a student who's doing something that's disruptive either to their own learning or to your teaching or to other students' learning, then you can put it in this category and you can start thinking about it in that sort of way. Okay, so that's the disruptive behaviours. Again, you can see why teachers, teacher aides deal with this kind of stuff constantly. And like I said, I don't know if it happened 400 times a day, but that wouldn't surprise me. But certainly it is a non-stop type of thing that you're dealing with all the time. Okay, so we'll move over to behaviours of concern. So obviously with behaviours of concern, we've got direct swearing. We've got any type of illegal activity. We've got anything to do with alcohol or drugs. That's another one. Anything to do that has anything to do with a safety issue. Anything to do with like the meltdown, as we call it, and running away. So all of those things there are the types of issues where if they happen, then they are much more serious. They don't happen as often. These things aren't going to happen 400 times a day. At least you wouldn't hope that they would happen 400 times a day. Unlike these types of things, which literally are non-stop. And good teachers are walking around, teacher aides are walking around. You don't have to deal with all these things constantly, but it's best practice to. So you walk around, you're talking to a student, you're getting to pick up little bits of rubbish and you're asking them how they're going, you're doing your formative assessment and providing feedback and stuff. At the same time, you're talking to this student, you're looking at that student, so you've got all these little low-key responses. So 10 things are happening all at once in this sort of area. This is where everything stops. Everything stops. All the learning of all the other students generally stops. All the other teachers in the class, teacher aides, it all stops, and this becomes the number one focus for a significant period of time. So that's, I guess another way of sort of defining the difference between the two. So any of those, we were talking before about those power type situations, revenge type situations, or sort of sabotage and those types of things. So they are any type of theft. And the point where it gets highly repetitive and defiant behaviour, which is actually a really important one. Now, sometimes defiant behaviour can be over here. It really depends. And the same with highly repetitive. This is obviously highly repetitive, but if it's the same student causing, eating in class all the time or causing problems, maybe it becomes a behaviour concern. So you need to make that decision. Now, the big thing here is if a student is doing some of these things on multiple occasions, and again, it's not caused by a disability or a disorder, or it's not an unexpected change. They've been doing it over a long period of time or a long enough period of time. And it's definitely a behaviour of concern because even something small, like I said, eating in class, it's actually defiant behaviour. So in a way, they're actually bullying the teacher in sort of a sense. Now, it's not necessarily a power thing. It can quite often be an attention-seeking thing. a lot of students who misbehave do so because they want the attention of their teacher or their teacher aide or other people in their class or whatnot. Sometimes they want the attention of the manager that the teacher sends them to when they get in trouble. That happens all the time, and they'll come back with hopefully they don't come back with a lollipop, because then you know you're in big trouble, because that kid's going to be trying to get kicked out of class, be doing anything to get kicked out of class if that's the case. But that doesn't happen too often anymore. Sometimes it does, but very rarely. So now the big thing and the final thing that we'll talk about in 30 seconds or less is why these are important. And they are important because if they fall into this category, you're going to treat it in a certain way. If they fall into this category, then you're going to treat it in a slightly different way. Now, if you're developing a behaviour management system of sorts, or you're sitting down and you're talking to your team, or even just thinking about your behaviour of your class as a whole, or even if you're a teacher aide and you're starting out afresh and you're in a new class, and you're thinking about the best way that you can help the teacher and help kids and where you're going to circulate and all this kind of stuff, or where you should spend your time and effort and energy in the limited time that you've got. Say after school, you're going to talk to the teacher for 10 minutes or those types of things. You can't go through everything that happened. So you may need to choose or be able to define where those behaviours fell into. So if they're falling into this sort of category, you deal with that as you go. If it's falling into this category, then that's something where after school you're talking to the teacher, or the teacher's talking with their support workers or parents or whatever, but you're sitting down and you're thinking about it in some way and trying to come up with a solution for it. These are the ones that cause huge amounts of stress. These are the ones that cause people to quit and find work in completely different industries. These are annoying, but they can be dealt with relatively easy. These require our concerted, conscious effort, normally a multi-pronged approach and various different strategies. And that's not to say that these are difficult to deal with, because if you clearly, I think one of the first steps in identifying or figuring out what to do, so if we see a teacher, say that you've got an average class, you've got a teacher and you've got a teacher aide, and you've got 20 odd kids, say 23 kids, and the teacher's pulling their hair out and they don't know what to do, and students are really misbehaving, and everyone's all stressed out and it seems like it's getting worse and there's hardly any learning happening or whatever, the first thing we do is look at, well, what are the disruptive behaviours, and to what extent, let's define them, and to what extent are each of them, are they occurring, and then which ones are the behaviours of concern. So can we move any of these into this list, and we play around with that, and that gives you a really good way to start categorising and approaching how to go about trying to manage those different behaviours. Because if it is a behaviour of concern, that means you put proper systems in place. It's serious. You start looking at, say, a behaviour card, or getting the principal involved, parents, whatever's going on, because that's a serious work health and safety issue for you as the educational professional, because you're, in a way, I mean, if you're dealing with alcohol and drugs, if you're dealing with power, theft, all this kind of stuff, no one should have to put up with that in any workplace. So these are the ones you want to come up with a way of dealing with immediately. These are by and large kids being kids. And again, obviously there's a spectrum. And then we can start figuring out, okay, we've dealt with those. How do we deal with these? What are the most annoying ones? What ones can we deal with straight away with a couple of strategies? Some of them we can deal with straight away. So usually, for example, noise levels, that's an easy one. Wearing the hat, that's usually takes a lesson or two. We sort that one out. Eating's not a problem. Getting out of the seat can be a bit more difficult. The throwing rubbish is easy. Dropping rubbish is ridiculously easy to deal with. Slow to start work can be a bit more difficult. So, but point is, it's that we can deal with a lot of these very simply with some basic strategies. These ones take a lot more effort. So, but by categorising them, we can then start attacking them and treating them appropriately based on that category. So that's the 4 types of behaviour, and some examples of disruptive and behaviours of concern. A couple of additional categories that I like to add on there, and I hope that helps. Please watch my other videos, particularly the root causes of behaviour, because I think that's also important, and an important sort of complement to this information here. I hope that helps.